The history of Atlanta dates back to 1836, when Georgia decided to build a railroad to the U.S.Midwest, and a location was chosen to be the line's terminus. The stake marking the founding of Terminus was driven into the ground in 1837. In 1839, homes and a store were built there, and the settlement grew. Between 1845 and 1854, rail lines arrived from 4 different directions, and the rapidly growing town quickly became the rail hub for the entire southern United States. During the American Civil War, Atlanta, as a distribution hub, became the target of a major Union campaign, and in 1864 Union General Sherman's troops set on fire and destroyed the city's assets and buildings, save churches and hospitals. After the war, the population grew rapidly, as did manufacturing, while the city retained its role as a rail hub. Coca-Cola was launched here in 1886 and grew into an Atlanta-based world empire. Electric streetcars arrived in 1889, and the city added new streetcar suburbs. The city's elite black colleges were founded between 1865 and 1885, and despite disenfranchisement and the later imposition of Jim Crow laws in the 1910s, a prosperous black middle class and upper class emerged. By the early 20th century, Sweet Auburn Avenue was called the most prosperous Negro street in the nation. In the 1950s, blacks started moving into city neighborhoods that had previously kept them out, while Atlanta's first freeways enabled large numbers of whites to move to and commute from new suburbs. Atlanta was home to Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., and a major center for the civil rights movement. Resulting desegregation occurred in stages over the 1960s. Slums were raised, and the new Atlanta Housing Authority built public housing projects. For the mid-60s to mid-70s, 9 suburban malls opened, and a downtown shopping district declined. But just north of it, gleaming office towers and hotels rose. And in 1976, the new Georgia World Congress Center signaled Atlanta's rise as a major convention city. In 1973, the city elected its first black mayor, Maynard Jackson, and in ensuing decades, black political leaders worked successfully with the white business community to promote business growth while still empowering black businesses. For the mid-70s to mid-80s, most of the MARTA rapid transit system was built, while the suburbs grew rapidly. Much of the city itself deteriorated, and the city lost 21% of its population between 1970 and 1990. In 1996, Atlanta hosted the Summer Olympics, for which new facilities and infrastructure were built. Hometown airline Delta continued to grow, and by 1998-9, Atlanta's airport was the busiest in the world. Since the mid-90s, gentrification has given new life to many of the city's in-town neighborhoods. The 2010 census showed blacks leaving the city, whites moving to the city, and a much more diverse metro area with heaviest growth in the exurbs at its outer edges. Native American civilization. Before 1836, the region where Atlanta and its suburbs were built was originally Creek and Cherokee Native American territory. In 1813, the Creeks, who had been recruited by the British to assist them in the War of 1812, attacked and burned Fort Mims in southwestern Alabama. The conflict broadened and became known as the Creek War. In response, the United States built a string of forts along the Ocmulgee and Chattahoochee rivers, including Fort Daniel on top of Hog Mountain near present-day Dacula, Georgia, and Fort Gilmer. Fort Gilmer was situated next to an important Indian site called Standing Peachtree, named after a large tree which is believed to have been a pine tree. The word pitch was misunderstood for peach, thus the site's name. The site traditionally marked a Native American meeting place at the boundary between Creek and Cherokee lands, at the point where Peachtree Creek flows into the Chattahoochee. The fort was soon renamed Fort Peachtree. A road was built linking Fort Peachtree and Fort Daniel following the route of existing trails. As part of the systematic removal of Native Americans from northern Georgia from 1802 to 1825, the Creek ceded the area that is now Metro Atlanta in 1821. White settlers arrived in 1822, and nearby Decatur was founded the following year. In 1830 an inn was established which would be known as Whitehall due to the then unusual fact that it had a coat of white paint when most other buildings were of washed and natural wood. Later, Whitehall Street would be built as the road from Atlanta to Whitehall. The Whitehall area would be renamed West End in 1867 and is the oldest intact Victorian neighborhood of Atlanta. In 1835, some leaders of the Cherokee Nation ceded the territory to the United States without the consent of the majority of the Cherokee people in exchange for land out west under the Treaty of New Echota, an act that led to the Trail of Tears. From railroad terminus to Atlanta, 1836 to 1860. In 1836, the Georgia General Assembly voted to build the Western and Atlantic Railroad to provide a link between the port of Savannah and the Midwest. The initial route of that state-sponsored project was to run from Chattanooga, Tennessee, to a spot east of the Chattahoochee River, in present-day Fulton County. The plan was to eventually link up with the Georgia Railroad from Augusta and with the Macon and Western Railroad, which ran between Macon and Savannah. U.S. Army engineer Colonel Stephen Harriman Long was asked to recommend the location where the Western and Atlantic line would terminate. He surveyed various possible routes. Then in the autumn of 1837 drove a stake into the ground between what are now Forsyth Street and Andrew Young International Boulevard, about 3 to 4 blocks northwest of today's 5 Points. The 0 post was later placed to mark that spot. In 1839, John Thrasher built homes and a general store in this vicinity, and the settlement was nicknamed Thrasherville. A marker identifies the location of Thrasherville at 104 Marietta Street, North, W, in front of the State Bar of Georgia building, between Spring and Cone Streets. Closing parenthesis. It was at this point that Thrasher built the Monroe Embankment, an earthen embankment that was to carry the Monroe Railway to meet the W&A at the terminus. This is the oldest existing man-made structure in downtown Atlanta. In 1842, the planned terminus location was moved 4 blocks southeast to what would become State Square, on Wall Street between Central Avenue and Pryor Street. Closing parenthesis. It is at this location that the 0 post can now be found, adjacent to the southern entrance of underground Atlanta. As the settlement grew, it became known as Terminus, literally meaning end of the line. By 1842, the settlement at Terminus had 6 buildings and 30 residents. Meanwhile, settlement began at what would become the Buckhead section of Atlanta, several miles north of today's downtown. In 1838, Henry Irby started a tavern and grocery at what would become the intersection of Pace's Ferry and Roswell Roads. In 1842, when a 2-story brick depot was built, the locals asked that the settlement of Terminus be called Lumpkin, after Governor Wilson Lumpkin. Gov. Lumpkin asked them to name it after his young daughter instead, and Terminus became Marthasville. In 1845, the chief engineer of the Georgia Railroad suggested that Marthasville be renamed Atlantica Pacifica, which was quickly shortened to Atlanta. The residents approved, apparently undaunted by the fact that not a single train had yet visited. The town of Atlanta was incorporated in 1847. Growth and development into a regional rail hub. The first Georgia Railroad freight and passenger trains from Augusta arrived in September 1845, and in that year the first hotel, the Atlanta Hotel, was opened. In 1846, the Second Railroad Company, the Macon and Amp Western, completed tracks to Terminus, Atlanta, connecting the little settlement with Macon to the south and Savannah to the southeast. The town then began to boom. In late 1846, the Washington Hall Hotel was opened. By 1847, the population had reached 2,500. In 1848, the first mayor was elected, the first homicide occurred, and the first jail was built. A new city council approved the building of wooden sidewalks, banned conducting business on Sundays, and appointed a town marshal. In 1849, Atlanta's third and largest antebellum hotel was built, the Trout House, and a daily intelligence became the town's first successful daily newspaper. In 1850, Oakland Cemetery was founded southeast of town, where it remains today. It's within the city limits now. In 1851, a third rail line, the Western and Atlantic Railroad, for which the site of Atlanta had been identified as a terminus, finally arrived, connecting Atlanta to Chattanooga in the northwest and opening up Georgia to trade with the Tennessee and Ohio River valleys, and the American Midwest. The Union Depot was completed in 1853 on State Square. That year, the depot architect Edward A. Vincent also delivered Atlanta's first official map to the city council. Fulton County was established in 1853 from the western section of DeKalb, and in 1854 a combination Fulton County Courthouse and Atlanta City Hall was built, which would be razed 30 years later to make way for today's State Capitol building. In 1854, a fourth rail line, the Atlanta and LaGrange Railroad, arrived, connecting Atlanta with LaGrange, Georgia to the southwest, sealing Atlanta's role as a rail hub for the entire South, with lines to the northwest, east, southeast, and southwest. By 1855, the town had grown to 6,025 residents and had a bank, a daily newspaper, a factory to build freight cars, a new brick depot, property taxes, a gasworks, gas streetlights, a theater, a medical college, and juvenile delinquency. Manufacturing and commerce. The first true manufacturing establishment was opened in 1844, when Jonathan Norcross, who would later become mayor of Atlanta, arrived in Marthasville and built a sawmill. Richard Peters, Lemuel Grant, John Mims built a 3-story flour mill, which was used as a pistol factory during the Civil War. In 1848, Austin Layden started the town's first foundry and machine shop, which would later become the Atlanta Machine Works. The Atlanta Rolling Mill was built in 1858 near Oakland Cemetery. It soon became the South's second most productive rolling mill. During the American Civil War, it rolled out cannon, iron rail, and 2-inch thick sheets of iron to clad the CSS Virginia for the Confederate Navy. The mill was destroyed by the Union Army in 1864. The city became a busy center for cotton distribution. As an example, in 1859 the Georgia Railroad alone sent 3,000 empty rail cars to the city to be loaded with cotton. By 1860 the city had 4 large machine shops, 2 planing mills, 3 tanneries, 2 shoe factories, a soap factory, and clothing factories employing 75 people. Slavery in antebellum Atlanta. In 1850, out of 2,572 people, 493 were enslaved African Americans, and 18 were free blacks, for a total black population of 20%. The black proportion of Atlanta's population would become much higher after the Civil War, when freed slaves would come to Atlanta in search of opportunity. There were several slave auction houses in the town, which advertised in the newspapers and many of which also traded in manufactured goods. Civil War and Reconstruction, 1861 to 1871. Civil War, 1861 to 1865. During the American Civil War, Atlanta served as an important railroad and military supply hub. In 1864, the city became the target of a major Union invasion. The area now covered by Atlanta was the scene of several battles, including the Battle of Peachtree Creek, the Battle of Atlanta, and the Battle of Ezra Church. General Sherman cut the last supply line to Atlanta at the Battle of Jonesboro Fort on August 31, September 1. With all of his supply lines cut, Confederate General John Bell Hood was forced to abandon Atlanta. On the night of September 1, his troops marched out of the city to Lovejoy, Georgia. General Hood ordered that the 81 rail cars filled with ammunition and other military supplies be destroyed. The resulting fire and explosions were heard for miles. The next day, Mayor James Calhoun surrendered the city, and on September 7 Sherman ordered the civilian population to evacuate. He then ordered Atlanta burned to the ground on November 11 in preparation for his punitive march south. After a plea by Father Thomas O'Reilly of Immaculate Conception Catholic Church, Sherman did not burn the city's churches or hospitals. The remaining war resources were then destroyed in the aftermath, and in Sherman's march to the sea. The fall of Atlanta was a critical point in the Civil War. Its much publicized fall gave confidence to the Northerners. Together with the Battle of Mobile Bay, the fall of Atlanta led to the re-election of Abraham Lincoln and the eventual surrender of the Confederacy. Reconstruction. The city emerged from the ashes, hence the city's symbol, the phoenix, and was gradually rebuilt, as its population increased rapidly after the war. Atlanta received migrants from surrounding counties and states. From 1860 to 1870, Fulton County more than doubled in population, from 14,427 to 33,446. In a pattern seen across the South after the Civil War, many freedmen moved from plantations to towns or cities for work, including Atlanta. Fulton County went from 20.5% black in 1860 to 45.7% black in 1870. Food supplies were erratic due to poor harvests, which were a result of the turmoil in the agricultural labor supply after emancipation of the slaves. Many refugees were destitute without even proper clothing or shoes. The AMA helped fill the gap with food, shelter, and clothing, and the federally sponsored Freedmen's Bureau also offered much help, though erratically. The destruction of the housing stock by the Union Army, together with the massive influx of refugees, resulted in a severe housing shortage. 1/8 acre to 1/4 acre lots with a small house rented for $5 per month, while those with a glass pane rented for $20. High rents rather than laws led to de facto segregation, with most blacks settling in three shantytown areas at the city's edge. Their housing was substandard. An AMA missionary remarked that many houses were rickety shacks rented at inflated rates. Two of the three shantytowns sat in low-lying areas prone to flooding and sewage overflows, which resulted in outbreaks of disease in the late 19th century. A shantytown named Tight Squeeze developed at Peachtree at what is now 10th Street in Midtown Atlanta. It was infamous for vagrancy, desperation, robberies of merchants, transients. The settlement. A smallpox epidemic hit Atlanta in December 1865, and there were not enough doctors or hospital facilities. Another epidemic hit in fall 1866. Hundreds died. Construction created many new jobs, employment boomed. Atlanta soon became the industrial and commercial center of the South. From 1867 until 1888, U.S. Army soldiers occupied McPherson Barracks in southwest Atlanta to ensure Reconstruction-era reforms. In 1868, Atlanta became the Georgia state capital, taking over from Milledgeville. Center of Black Education. Atlanta quickly became a center of black education. Atlanta University was established in 1865, the forerunner of Morehouse College in 1867, Clark University in 1869, what is now Spelman College in 1881, and Morris Brown College in 1885. This would be one of several factors aiding the establishment of one of the nation's oldest and best established African-American elite in Atlanta. Gate City of the New South, 1872 to 1905. The New South. Henry W. Grady, the editor of the Atlanta Constitution, promoted the city to investors as a city of the New South, by which he meant a diversification of the economy away from agriculture, and a shift from the Old South attitudes of slavery and rebellion. As part of the effort to modernize the South, Grady and many others also supported the creation of the Georgia School of Technology, which was founded on the city's northern outskirts in 1885. With Grady's support, the Confederate Soldiers' Home was built in 1889. In 1880, Sister Cecilia Carroll, RSM, and 3 companions traveled from Savannah, Georgia to Atlanta to minister to the sick. With just 50 cents in the collective purse, the sisters opened the Atlanta Hospital, the first medical facility in the city after the Civil War. This later became known as St. Joseph's Hospital. Expansion and the first planned suburbs starting in 1871, horse-drawn, and later, starting in 1888, electric streetcars fueled real estate development and the city's expansion. Washington Street south of downtown, and Peachtree Street north of the central business district, became wealthy residential areas. In the 1890s, West End became the suburb of choice for the city's elite, but Inman Park, planned as a harmonious whole, soon overtook it in prestige. Peachtree Street expansions reached ever further north into what is now Midtown Atlanta, including Amos G. Road as Mansion Roads Hall, which can still be visited. Atlanta surpassed Savannah as Georgia's largest city by 1880. Disenfranchisement of blacks as Atlanta grew, ethnic and racial tensions mounted. Late 19th and early 20th century immigration added a very small number of new Europeans to the mix. After Reconstruction, whites had used a variety of tactics, including militias and legislation, to re-establish political and social supremacy throughout the South. Starting with the poll tax in 1877, by the turn of the century, Georgia passed a variety of legislation that completed the disfranchisement of blacks. Not even college-educated men could vote. Nonetheless, African Americans in Atlanta had been developing their own businesses, institutions, churches, and a strong, educated middle class. Coca-Cola. The identities of Atlanta and Coca-Cola have been intertwined since 1886, when John Pemberton developed the soft drink in response to Atlanta and Fulton County going dry. The first sales were at Jacobs Pharmacy in Atlanta. Asher Griggs Candler acquired a stake in Pemberton's company in 1887 and incorporated it as the Coca-Cola Company in 1888. In 1892, Candela incorporated a second company, the Coca-Cola Company, the current corporation. By the time of its 50th anniversary, the drink had reached the status of a national icon in the USA. Coca-Cola's world headquarters have remained in Atlanta ever since. In 1991, the company opened the World of Coca-Cola, which has remained one of the city's top visitor attractions. Cotton States Expo and Booker T. Washington's speech in 1895. The Cotton States and International Exposition was held at what is now Piedmont Park. Nearly 800,000 visitors attended the event. The exposition was designed to promote the region to the world and showcase products and new technologies, as well as to encourage trade with Latin America. The exposition featured exhibits from several states, including various innovations in agriculture and technology. President Grover Cleveland presided over the opening of the exposition, but the event is best remembered for the both hailed and criticized Atlanta Compromise speech given by Booker T. Washington, in which Southern blacks would work meekly and submit to white political rule, while Southern whites guaranteed that blacks would receive basic education and due process in law.